Now we can go to Max for us to see how to animate objects. Just to remind about frames visualization. We have a number of frames to complete 1 second of animation. And we usually use 24 frames per second. That's it. We're gonna have 24 renderings to complete 1 second of animation. You have probably seen your camera, your cell phone shoots in 30 FPS, 60 FPS. 60 FPS means 60 frames per second. Alright, 30 FPS is 30 frames per second. And you can also make 30 frames per second or 60. What's the difference? For the drawing by hand, when I worked in Asterix, we used 12 FPS, which are 12 frames per second. And what is the difference between 12 and 60? Look, the more frames per second, more fluid the animation is. Because even if you don't notice that it is a still object, and we understand that as a movement, but a distance to move from here to here divided by 12 frames, for example, it would make a considerable distance. Then we're gonna see these spaces in between, so the animation starts being kind of chopped. That is almost imperceptible. But when you compare it to a 60 FPS animation, just imagine this space divided into 60. That becomes very smooth. We can see the movement very fluid. So let's make everything 60 frames per second. It would be great. But every computer rendering, no matter how fast the software is, it takes a long time to render. So, the real difference from 60 frames per second in an animation to 30 FPS is almost non-noticeable. Why 24? Because 24 is the standard for movies. So I'm gonna use 24, because it is the standard for movies. And it really is an FPS rate, which is very fluid. We have no problems with that. We're gonna look at the animation and say that it's perfect. For example, the animation I done, The Last Flight. It was done in 24 FPS, and we can see everything very fluid. Another effect that we already talked about motion blur, right? Motion blur is when the objects are in motion, and we can see that blur. In animation, it's very cool to use motion blur, because the object tree can kind of connect one frame to the other, and it becomes very fluid. Even when we have not only, but 24 frames per second, and not 60, 90, 120, 240 FPS, which is possible to shoot. So, as we're gonna use 24 frames per second, we can also calculate how long the animation will be. So, for example, for you to create a 1 minute long animation, 60 seconds times 24, we need 1440 frames. Alright, and where are these frames? We can see here. We have these 4 windows. And down here, this is called time slider, which is the timeline. This slider is where the time is running, where the frame is. And by default, when you open Max, it starts in 0 and goes to 100. Alright, but maybe you just want to have 5 seconds of animation. And 5 times 24 is 120. There's no problem at all. We have something called time configuration, which is this clock icon with a gear. You're gonna open it and go to animation and time. It is from 0 to 100, so you're gonna have 120 to work with. Actually, this is just what we see, because if you merged an object that has 240 seconds of animation, it's gonna continue animating 240. The only difference is when it reaches 120, it's gonna stop. Then, in the time configuration, in this exact place, without using rescale, it is just what you seeing. Look, 240. It is 240 frames now. And if you make only 24, for example, just to animate 1 second only, it's here. From 0 to 24, you can see the 24 frames. Alright? That is just for you to know where you can change the number of the frames. Here, in the time slider, that is just for you to know where you can change the number of the frames that you see in the time slider. Alright? That's what you need to know for now. I'm gonna show you some more things as we advance, but I want to show you in practice. As the classes go, I'm gonna show you. That said, I think you know now what time slider is and how the frames work in an animation.